Now, as he continues in these situation, back to the book, suddenly my preoccupation with the problems of others ceased. There was a familiar whine overhead, and I found myself propelled into the half-dug trench, all but on top of Galbraith and Robert. The action had been a reflex. I knew that I had made no conscious decision to jump. As I lay there with my second-in-command's entrenching tool carving into a ridge in my left buttock, the mortar bomb burst about 8 feet to the right. The scream of the shards of jagged metal passing just overhead flailed my ears as earth and stones spattered down on top of us. The stench of high explosive filled the trench. My face, I found, was pressed into the coarse material of Corporal Galbraith's battle trousers. Gingerly raising my head, I peered over the low parapet. At the foot of a tree some 15 yards away lay a motionless heap, a green and khaki bundle which did not stir. Jumping out of the trench, I ran across and turned over the limp body. The head fell back to show the open, staring eyes of Sergeant Hawks, one of the 7 platoon section commanders, a bright young NCO, only just promoted, who had been with the battalion since the day it was raised. He was another old friend. At first I could see no sign of injury, but then I noticed the small hole in the back of Hawk's helmet and the thin stream of blood streaking the back of his neck. Lying by Huggins' side, I seemed to count 7 explosions, all just a little further away than the first, but still close enough to smell the hot gases. There was a short pause, and then, as if it were an afterthought, an 8th bomb struck the branches of the tree just above us, directing its hot metal splinters down to the trenches below. A half-strangled cry of distress brought my head up, just in time to see Corporal Pritchard clamber out of his slit and race across towards the cry, his haversack of medical supplies marked with its red cross dangling from his hand. The pause lasted no more than a half a minute. Again the whine. Again I ducked. This was the covering fire for a counterattack. Was this the covering fire for a counterattack, or were the Boche merely harassing us spitefully? But when I raised my head from Huggins' boots to look around, I was relieved to see one of the 7 platoon Bren gunners, his helmet and eyes just above the level of the parapet, gazing down the track towards his front. So the sentries were still doing their job. The fire was not forcing their heads down. If this was the covering fire for an attack, we would not be caught unawares. So that's the standard procedure right here for the Germans, and really for anyone. It's cover and move, right? We put in big bombs, we put in mortars, we put in artillery, and while you're hiding and while you're ducking down so you don't get killed, they maneuver in. And then right when they get so close that they're in danger of their own artillery, the artillery stops and then they proceed with the assault. Here we go. The lull. Now there's a lull. The lull provided a chance to finish digging. There was no longer any need to persuade the men to dig faster. The lesson had really been driven home. We'd been digging for no more than a few minutes when the sound of firing to the north slackened. But the noise from the vehicles in front had increased. The thud of guns only a few hundred yards away was punctuated by the hammering of Brens. By the way, Brens, I don't think I've said this, Brens are sort of the a weapon, a British machine gun, versus the Spandau, which is the German machine guns. And they use, the Brits and the Americans use the term Spandau to talk about basically heavier machine guns, but that's what they're talking about when they're talking about Spandau. And then a Bren is the Brit machine gun. Both forward platoons were in action, and I had placed company headquarters too far back to be able to see what was happening. The walkie-talkies were silent. Also, I worried about the sitting of the platoon some 300 yards apart, each isolated in its own corner of the woods and unable to support the others against a determined attack. This is so important for tactical leaders out there. Think about these lessons, and these are lessons that I talk about all the time. And these are lessons that I used to have to teach all the time. So you've got your platoons. They're out there doing something. You need to be close enough that you have communications with them so that you actually understand what's happening. And this is the same in the business world. If you put yourself in a position where you don't understand what's happening in the field, then you're not going to be able to help. You're not going to be able to support. You're not going to be able to understand what's happening so you can make decisions. So in this point, he's positioned himself too far away. On top of that, he's positioned his platoons too far apart from each other. So if you're too far apart from each other, you can't cover for each other. If you can't cover, you can't move. And if you can't move, you can't win. So those are critical points. Make sure your command position is close enough, not so close that you're getting in the firefight. No, not so close that you're pinned down, but close enough so that you understand what is happening. And then if you have multiple elements in the field, you get them close enough to each other that they can support each other. Always. He sees a guy running back, and here we go, back to the book. It was Sergeant Pryor, one of Nesbitt's section commanders, a rather sulky man, able and well-educated, but with a grudge against authority. In his left hand, Pryor grasped his sten in a grip so firm that the knuckles showed blue under the sunburn. His right arm, from which clothing had been cut away at the shoulder, was thrust into the front of his smock, the elbow covered by a blood-stained dressing. His face was white with shock and taut with pain. A morphia injection was doing little to alleviate the agony of an elbow smashed by a bullet. The news Pryor brought was serious. The vehicles which we could hear were Boche armor, driving backwards and forward along the road and sweeping the front of 9 platoons' position, secure from retaliation. So far, the armor had only claimed Pryor, but Sergeant Avondale had been killed by a mortar fragment as he dashed across between a couple of trees to put some question to Nesbitt. This inexorable loss of skilled leaders was serious. In our parachute battalions, unlike usual infantry units, section leaders ranked as sergeants, not corporals. 9 platoon had now lost not only its officer, but 3 of its 4 sergeants as well. Hawks was dead, and 1 of 7 platoon section commanders had failed to appear at the rendezvous after the drop. Already, nearly half the sergeants had become casualties. This is just a nightmare unfolding.